For this coding challenge, you have to write a Python program that will count and print all the characters that are repeated in a given string. So let's see how you can do that. I'm going to show you 3 alternatives. They all have slight modifications that can improve the efficiency and quality of your code. So let's start with the first option. The first step, of course, is to define a variable s, which is going to store a string. We're going to work with the string hello. We can see that the only repeated character is L. It's repeated 2 times. So the output should be 1 because only one character is repeated and that character is the letter L. That letter L should be printed on a different line. To get how many characters are repeated in the string, the number of characters, remember, we're not going to count the repetitions. We're not going to count how many times the characters are repeated. We're going to count how many characters are repeated. So for every repeated character, we have to increment a count by 1. And we need a variable. This variable starts from 0 because possibly the string can have no repeated characters. And we also need a list to store the repeated characters. We're going to add those characters to this list as we find them, because we have to print them on a separate line. Here we have a for loop. For every character in the string s that we defined right here, we are going to check if that character appears in the string s more than once. So that is why we call the count method on the string to get how many times the character appears on a string. If that number of occurrences is greater than 1, so it is repeated, and that character is not already in the list of repeated characters, then we have to increment the count by 1 and append the character to the list of repeated characters. Let's review this to make sure that you understand how this works. For every character in the string, we are going to check if the character is repeated. If this condition is true, then the character is repeated. If the count, if how many times that character occurs in the string is greater than 1. And if that character has not been added already to the list of repeated characters, because remember that we only have to print them once in the output. For example, in this case, we have only one character that is repeated, the letter L. We have to print it only once, so we're going to add it only once to this list. So we are going to check if the character is not already in the list, so we avoid having any repeated elements in the list. If that is the case, if the character has not been added to the list, then we add it by appending it to the list, and we increment the counter before adding the element. So we are making all the changes that we need at this point, so we can print the repeated count. The first line in the output is the count, how many characters are repeated, so we can print at this point the repeated count. After we print the number of characters that are repeated, we have to print the character. But we do not want to print the list intact. We cannot just call print and pass within parentheses the name of the list, because we don't want to include the square brackets or the commas. We just want to separate the characters with a space. So what do we have to do? First, we have to check if the actual length of the repeated characters list is greater than 0. If there were repeated characters, because if there weren't any, then we don't have to print anything. We have to print the value none, okay, according to the description of the exercise. But if there were repeated characters and this list is not empty, then for every character in the list of repeated characters, in alphabetical order, that is why we call the sorted function. Sorted returns the list in alphabetical order, so we can iterate over the characters in alphabetical order and print them on the same line. We print the character, and instead of printing a new line after the character, we end the string with a space. That way, the next time we print the next character, that character will be on the same line as the previous character, but separated by a space. Great, so now you know how this first alternative works. Let's save the file and run the code. Right here we can see this. Let me zoom in so you can see the original string that we are analyzing. The string is hello. We have 2 letter L's, So there is one repeated character, and that character is the letter L. It is repeated 2 times, but in this problem we are not interested in the number of repetitions. We're interested in the character that is repeated. Okay? So if we test this, for example, with the string corporation, and we run the code, we can see that there are 2 repeated characters, the letter O and the letter R. The letter O is clearly repeated 3 times, so this is correct, and we also get that the letter R is repeated. It is repeated 2 times, so we see it right here. And we're getting the output in alphabetical order, just like we expected. Let's try this with the string Python as well, because this string doesn't have any repeated characters, and we need to check if this works as we expected. Like this. There are 0 repeated characters, and the output in the second line is none. Exactly what we needed according to the description of the challenge. If there weren't any repeated characters, we should print the value none. Great, so this first alternative works as we expected. Let's check out the small modifications that I made for alternative number 2. First, let's comment this code out and uncomment the code for option 2. For option 2, the first part of the solution is exactly the same. We have the string, we have the counter, the list of characters, and we have the loop and the condition. We also print the count. Up to this point, everything is exactly the same, but when we reach this conditional, things start to change a little bit. Let's see why. Focus right here. We are replacing the condition that checks if the length of the list is greater than 0. In our previous solution, we were checking if the length of the list was greater than 0 to see if there were any repeated characters. But now we are using the fact that empty lists are false and non-empty lists are true. Since non-empty lists are truthy values and they evaluate to true by themselves when they are not empty, we can just use the list directly. By doing this, we are saying if the list repeated characters that we have right here is not empty, then do this. If this is false, if the list is empty, then the else clause will be executed. Now, if there are repeated characters and this is true, then we are going to run or execute this line. In our first solution, we had a for loop that printed every character in alphabetical order on the same line as the previous character. But now we are just using this syntax that looks a little bit different right here. It's just one line and we are not using any loops. What is this doing? This is taking the list of repeated characters and it is returning a sorted list, a sorted version of the characters. Then all the characters are being separated individually, what we call unpacked. The list is unpacked, each character is returned one at a time, and it is printed with this separator, which is the space character. So we're printing all the characters on the same line, and we're just using one line instead of a loop. Okay, this is really nice, and this is the operator that we use, an asterisk before a list to unpack it, to get the individual characters in the list or in the sequence. Let me save the file and run the code to see how it works. The output is exactly what we expected. Just one character is repeated, and that is the letter L in hello. Now for the string corporation, we see the output 2 and OR printed on the same line without the square brackets and separated by a space. And finally Python, where there are no repeated characters, we see 0 and none. This is our second alternative. Now for our third alternative, we have another small modification that can make our code even more concise. Previously, in our first two alternatives, we were keeping track of a counter, a variable that told us how many characters were repeated in the string. But actually, there isn't a direct need to create a different variable and update it in our code. We can just use the length of the list of repeated characters, and that will tell us how many characters are repeated in the string. That will make our code even more concise. Let's run the code, and we see the same output, 1L. Then we see corporation, and we run the code, and we see the output 2 and OR. And finally, when the string has no repeated characters, we see 0 and none. Exactly what we expected, and we removed an unnecessary variable. And we also removed the for loop from this part of the code. So we made a more concise and readable program. Great work! Now you know how to solve this challenge.